So, welcome to Leadership That Pays Off, Building CEO Level Thinking and Real Results, sponsored by ELB Learning. And with us today is Christine Haas. She's the Vice President of Leadership Strategy at ELB Learning, where she specializes in driving talent development, talent management, and organizational effectiveness. With a career defined by leadership and learning strategy and digital transformation, Christine is deeply committed to fostering environments that value continuous learning, career growth, and measurable business impact. Her expertise spans change management, performance management, and the design of comprehensive talent strategies aligned with organizational goals. By collaborating closely with teams and stakeholders, Christine has cultivated cultures of innovation and operational excellence, empowering employees through targeted skills development and career advancement initiatives. So let's please welcome Christine to the session. Christine, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. If you'd like to start sharing, the floor is all yours.
I will. Thank you so much. And thank you for that great introduction. Sounds more impressive than it is, I promise you. Listen, I just wanted to welcome everyone. As Mel was talking, I was sort of perusing our participant list and seeing some familiar names. So thank you for joining my TED Talk. Going to spend the next 45 minutes or so, maybe a little bit longer, talking about leadership that pays off. So, what I'd like to talk to you about today is what I call the new leadership playbook, right? We're going to talk about what it takes to lead in this era of AI, disruption, nonstop change. I'm sure you're all feeling that. My personal premise is simple. We don't just need more managers, right? We need leaders who think and act like owners, leaders who deliver measurable results. I like to call it building owners versus operators. And any of you who have been in the workplace for a while could probably relate to this, right? An operator might be a leader that kind of comes up through an organization in a particular department and is very used to leading in their silo, when what we really need to do is shift that thinking to more enterprise or horizontal aspect of that work. And we're going to talk about that today in this webinar. Mel's already done a great job of introducing me. I would just add to that I've been doing this type of work, talent development, talent management, organizational effectiveness, behavioral change for the sum of now 35 years. So I've seen this at several organizations. And what I hope that I bring to the table for you all today is that kind of real world experience that will help you to think through this maybe a little bit differently than you had. Or if you're stuck kind of going through this, looking for answers, trying to figure out what the future of leadership holds, hopefully today is an opportunity for you guys to be inspired at the very least, right? So I want to invite you to engage and interact. These concepts may be new to some and not as new to others. What I hope you get out of today is, like I just said, inspiration, a way to think differently about how you're developing your leaders and to be better prepared to lead in today's environment and tomorrow's, because things are changing, leadership is changing, and leaders need our guidance so that they're future ready. Your leadership programs may look different. This is not a one size fits all. Some of you are new to this work. Others may be in the trenches already. It's not possible that we'll talk. It's possible, sorry, that what we talk about today may not completely resonate with everybody. Take what you need, right? You do you. And if you've got some great ideas that I don't mention here, feel free to quote unquote speak up via the chat because we want to hear from you. Mel may have said this already. She will be monitoring the chat as we go through. I'm going to ask that we save questions to the end because we've got a lot to get through. But if any kind of themes start to emerge, then Mel will interrupt and I'll try to address those on the fly. Okay, so with that, we do have a lot of interactive content right out of the gate. And then after that, a lot to get through. Little housekeeping Mel's already gone into. I know it's tempting to multitask. I'm going to ask you to please stay with us and let's get started. So as we go into our little conversation today, I just wanted to start with this quote. And now, believe me, if any of you have been in this business for a while, you're probably familiar with the name Peter Drucker. You probably know that as opposed to some of the modern voices we hear today, Peter's is kind of a legacy voice. This quote is from a book that was published in 1980. So again, I don't know exactly everyone's on the call. Some of you may not have even been around then, but I think it's an important quote, and I think it rings true today, right? The greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic. And that really is the premise of what we want to talk about today. What we've been doing historically in the leadership development space is fine, but it's not going to carry us through all of this disruption we see today, through all of this digital transformation we see today. And so our leaders need to be able to think through that turbulence and disruption in different ways. Okay, so here's the reality. Most leadership programs haven't kept pace. They're still teaching yesterday's skills while the world is screaming for something new. Leaders are being developed to manage status quo, and what's needed are leaders who can drive transformation. That gap is costing organizations in agility, revenue, and talent retention. So, what leadership gurus like our friend Peter Drucker, or Covey, or Goldsmith, or Blanchard, Carnegie, or even some of our more modern voices like Simon Sinek, Brene Brown, you may follow these thought leaders on LinkedIn, they're bringing us human skills or power skills. And I have mad respect for all of them. What they teach and preach is important, it's inspirational, and it does indeed help individuals internalize and reflect and improve their leadership acumen, but it's not enough. Power skills is what I'm calling human skills or soft skills, right? They're important and they're foundational, but we need to build on top of those assets the necessary skills to lead into the next decade and beyond. Okay, so it's time for a poll. Like I said, we're going to kind of fall into our interactive part here early on in our conversation today. Let's let's talk about what your number one challenge is in leadership right now. Is it driving results? Is it adapting to AI? Is it speed of decision making? Is it retaining talent? Is it something else? Go ahead and vote, and this will give us a pulse on the room. And Mel, I know that you can see the results coming in. I guess we can keep this open for just a minute. If you're seeing quorum, just let me know and show the results.
Yeah, we're about halfway there, so
Great.
they're still voting.
All right. I see decision-making speed at 39%. I see engagement and retention at 25%. I see driving results at 19%. Little surprising, team, that I'm seeing adapting to AI at a 9%. So I'm quite curious as we go through our time together today to understand what that means. But these results are not surprising, right? And the decision making speed speaks very, very, very directly to one of the essential competencies I'm going to talk about today. So thank you guys for leaning in. And thank you for taking the poll down. We're gonna continue. Okay. So think about yesterday's playbook, right? Communication, delegation, performance. So many, again, going back to that concept of power skills or human skills that I talked to before. Useful, absolutely, but not enough. Today's world is volatile. The markets are shifting overnight. Industries are disrupted in months, not years. Leaders are being trained to keep the lights on, but not to innovate. And that's the gap. Okay, so what's the answer? The ownership mindset. When leaders think like a CEO, they stop waiting for direction. They act as if the business is theirs. They're accountable, they're decisive, and they're obsessed with outcomes. It's the difference between leaders who maintain and leaders who transform. Think about how you turn operators into owners and help leaders think outside their department to what's best for the business holistically. So, this is not a poll, but this is just an engagement prompt. And I want you guys to use the chat for this one. And so, Mel, you may have to help me with this, but drop one word in the chat that describes what ownership means to you as a leader. And actually, I do think I can see the chat this way. So, yeah, so if I'll repeat that, drop one word in the chat that describes what ownership means to you as a leader or leaders in your organization. Okay. Wow. Rapid fire. How do I make this bigger? All right, here we go. Um, so I'm looking at a lot of the things that you guys are putting in the chat, actively sponsoring their own initiatives, innovation and empathy, um, psych safety, innovation, caring, accountability, accountability, accountability. Wow, right. Autonomy, responsibility. And I'm not sure if it's responsibility if we're thinking accountability, but I've got that answer a couple times. Empowerment, lots of accountability and responsibility. Vision, forward movement. All right, y'all. Thank you for that. That's wonderful. And if you guys aren't paying attention to the chat, I invite you to do that too, as I do, just so that you can see some of the things that are coming through the chat. Okay. So then let's talk about our essential competencies. And I know that we just did that prompt and a lot of accountability came through. Like I said, we will talk about that. But given the flow of the slides that I prepared, we're just going to start with this one and let's talk through these. So the first must have competency in today's world and in prepping our leaders for tomorrow's is digital fluency, among others, right? I'm just highlighting some of the real key ones that are going to help our leaders succeed as we go forward. And when I say digital fluency, for sure I mean AI, but I think like so many of us, we get tired of hearing those two little letters a lot. But AI is a big thing, generative AI, agentic AI, and it's here and it's going to continue to be embedded within our workplaces and leaderships. Our leaders need to be prepared for that. So when I talk about digital fluency for leaders, I don't mean that they need to be coders. They don't need to understand deep data science, but they need to understand what AI and technology can and cannot do. Leaders who fear AI and technical transformation, they will get left behind. Leaders who embrace it will make smarter, faster decisions and guide their teams with confidence. If I go back to the chat prompt that we just did, there were several people who mentioned decision making or making faster decisions. And one of the ways leaders do that is by harnessing the digital tools and the output of those digital tools, that data, in order to make swift decisions. Okay, so we're going to do another poll, given that we're on this subject. So, how confident are you in your leaders' ability to leverage AI today? So, Mel, if you'll pull up the next poll, the options there are very confident, somewhat confident, not confident at all, or not sure. All right, the results are in. Okay, this is actually fantastic. And this is pretty aligned to what we saw coming out of the very first poll when I was asking you guys to answer the question about what's your top leadership challenges. I'm feeling pretty good with this group in particular that we're somewhat confident here. We may not be very confident, although a few of you are, but most of you are in the somewhat confident range. The not confident at all is also very real. So I want to call that out. The maturity curve in this space it runs the gamut, right? And a lot of that has to do with not just the knowledge and the awareness of what these digital tools will do, but also the size potentially of the company. And I don't mean size and like number of people necessarily, but I'm talking about the resources that you have or your ability to invest in this space, right? But again, if you're at the forefront of doing this, I feel like there are things that you can do to help you to continue to build this level of confidence with your leaders. And like I said before, it's tables. I didn't maybe didn't say it this way, but it's table stakes, and it's something that you're going to need to focus on. So if you do fall into that not confident at all category, or even the one above it, somewhat confident, it's probably in your best interest to really focus on this in your organization. The slide I hadn't really talked. Oh, hang on, let me pass here. So this is what we want to talk about in terms of the second competency. So The next one we want to talk about is agility and adaptability, right? So if the past few years have taught anything, it's that the plan never survives contact with reality. And hopefully that resonates with everybody. Because of the way they're moving, it just rarely does, right? Great leaders don't freeze, they pivot and they can navigate uncertainty without losing sight of the goal, right? Agility isn't just nice to have anymore, it is competitive advantage. So I want to do another engagement prompt here. And this again is just in chat. This will not be a poll, but think about a time in the past 12 months when you had to pivot quickly, or maybe leaders you support had to pivot quickly. What worked, what didn't, and why don't you share that in chat? Thank you, Mel. Are y'all sharing in chat? Mm, thank you, Juan. Analysis paralysis. Yeah, this one might take a little bit more noodling. So, and if you want, Mel, we can just leave this up for another minute. I want people to have a chance to think on it. Complaining, calm confidence. The team collaborating to get things done in quick fashion. What didn't work? The leadership team changing directions more than once. Oof, alignment. Yeah, that's a big one. Uninformed employees, messaging. That's a big one. In fact, I just posted about that this morning. Flexibility works. The pace on which we pivot. Interesting. Okay. What worked? Clear communication with the why, what, and how, what didn't, expecting that how it got translated down was clearly understood. Yeah, that speaks to messaging as well. And I hope as you guys are writing these and thinking through this, that you're also remembering, what I said at the onset. Like a lot of what you're talking about also does have to do with those human or power skills that are necessary for leaders to understand, how they kind of internalize and reflect and operate individually and even as a team. But we need to layer, some of these new competencies on top of that because at the end of the day, what those human or power skills do is they help fuel the rest of these competencies to drive results. So thank you guys for that. And again, like I said, if you're not monitoring the chat with me, I invite you to so that you can hear from your peers. It's sometimes very valuable to hear what some other people are going through. And we learn from that just as much as you learn from me. Okay. So let's talk about the third essential competency, and that is driving results. So my previous comments were a good setup for this. Leadership can't just be about good intentions or power or human skills. It has to connect directly to business impact. Every investment in leadership development should have a return. If it doesn't, it's window dressing, right? The best leaders build cultures and teams that deliver measurable results. That's what leadership really is all about. When you think about it fundamentally, is driving results through people. And so you've got to hone as a leader all of those skills that you need in order to drive those results through people. But at the end of the day, we're driving results so that we can make an impact so our businesses thrive, so our people thrive, right? Okay. So I guess the other thing I would say about that, and just think about that in your organizations, is if you think about historically, especially those of you who are responsible for leadership development in your organizations, if you think about how much you invest on an annual basis or even over a period of time, take whatever time horizon you feel like is important to you, think about that investment compared to how you measure the return on that investment. And I don't want to overuse ROI, even though that is absolutely a measure. I know, being a learning and development, talent development practitioner for as many years as I have been, that it's hard to measure. There's a lot of factors that go into measuring the efficacy of these types of programs, but leadership development is not inexpensive, right? It's something that companies pay a lot of money to do, but don't always see a lot of follow through. And so if that's true for you, I invite you to think about, do you just stop at these human skills, which makes it very difficult to measure at the back end? Or Do you start with those measurable outcomes in mind before you go down this road? If you can start with what you believe that shift or output should be, then it's going to be a little bit easier for you to measure. Okay, so let's go to our third and our final poll for this segment, and that is, does your organization currently measure the ROI of leadership? I want to hear from you. The options here are yes, rigorously, yes, loosely, no, but we should, or no, and we don't plan to. Poll is open. Hopefully, everyone's taken a minute to respond. Okay, poll is closed. And not surprised, 62% of you said no, but we should. Um, if you feel alone, don't anymore now that you've got that answer, right? And I'll tell you that having led these efforts at multiple companies, that answer is pretty accurate. But I think it goes without saying that it's absolutely something we need to be focusing on more as talent development practitioners, those of us who are, assuming that most of you are, even if you're in the business, for sure you know that there are ways that we've got to get better at justifying that investment, especially those of you who belong to organizations where it might be difficult and you're having to get really scrappy to get dollars to invest in these programs. If you can start with the end in mind, you'll have a better shot at getting the measurable results and outcomes that you need, and you'll be able to tell about better stories to your leaders and continue that healthy investment in the changes that you want to make with your development efforts. Actually, if you don't mind, let me go back. I do want to ask a follow-up question to this. And so maybe if you want to just throw some comments in the chat, if your answer was no, and for most of you it was, what's the barrier? Lack of knowledge, lack of the ability to do it, the fact that it's not easy to measure skills development. What does that mean for you? Okay, let's see. Not a priority. That's honest. Um, Lack of measurement skills, connecting to data sources, access to performance data, other factors more impactful, lack of structure. They're coming in fast. Sorry, I not read all of them. Lack of knowledge, lack of LMS versus business systems connected to be able to see results. Okay, yeah, yeah, that's fair. And so, in my experience, I've done this primarily, sometimes as a standalone learning organization, but I would say more often than not at the companies that I've worked for, as a COE or center of excellence of an HR team. And obviously, that does make some logical sense, right? Because anything that you're doing with employee development does, fall into HR in numerous ways, right? It fuels workforce strategies, workforce strategy development. It fuels total rewards and engagement. There's a lot of factors to the approach to learning in an organization. Um, but I say that, and the reason I'm kind of doubling down on this is because if you are in that boat and you are part of an HR team, um, the HR team is usually the last to be invested in. And we're seeing that shift, we're seeing that change. LMS systems, whether that's just a pure LMS or various digital learning platforms or learning experience platforms, all of that kind of woven together is so important to fuel not only the employee and leader experience in the space, but also for y'all as practitioners to get that data to be able to have what you need foundationally to grab these measurements and metrics, and then obviously show that output. But it can't just be an LMS though either, right? You've got to be thinking about this along with your partners in the business to figure out what's the extent of behavioral change you want to see. And if you are doing something like you know, learning surveys or what have you after any kind of program that you do, that's great. And it takes a look at the quality of the program that you just delivered. But unless you're really leaning into continuous measurement over time, whether that be via knowledge checks or other assessments or um, assessment over time at intervals, or leader observations, or a combination of all of those things, you're probably not going to get to those actual measurable outcomes. And so I would encourage you all to be thinking through that. And if you're in that boat where you don't have those resources, you don't have a system, or it's not a priority, you know, then I would encourage you to tell this story to your leadership team in order to get their buy-in, in you know, to do that. Without it, you know, I think going forward, having these leadership development or all learning and development approaches, it can be a hard sell because it is quite a heavy investment, and it's just going to keep getting heavier because things are moving very fast. Okay, now we'll continue on. So here's what doesn't work. One size fits all training. So if you're in this boat with your leadership development, something to think about. The reason why I added this here is because, again, kind of going back to the power skills, human skills, the the legacy playbook talks a lot about leadership development at scale and wanting to build that consistency. And I'm a huge proponent of that. I do think that from your frontline leaders all the way up to your executive level, there should be some commonalities in the types of behavioral skills we want, or behavioral competencies we want to see within our leadership teams. And it starts as soon as somebody becomes a manager or you're preparing somebody to become a manager. However, as you get a higher up into that leadership arc, I do think it's worthwhile to think about some of those nuances. And so that's what I mean about all programs can't be a one size fits all. Your sales leaders might need something a little bit different than your finance leaders, that might need something a little bit different than your technology leaders. And so while the core of that should always be an organization's, you know, like, again, not to overuse the word core, but core, you know, behavioral competencies that you want to see and you want to develop, over the top of that, there probably are some nuances. The other thing I would mention here is that all organizations might approach this in a bit of a different way. So that's what I mean by that. The next thing is psychometric tools, right? A lot of the psychometric tools that are in the marketplace, they give a leader a personality label, but they don't improve business performance. And so that's something I want to talk about too, and I'll get to that in just a second. Um, Organizations waste millions on that every year, and so we've got to move past that. And so I'm going to talk about that. And this is what I mean. I want to be very fair here because I find, and throughout my career, I found great value in multiple psychometric tools, but not all tools are created equal, right? You're serving your leaders by providing psychometric assessments that give them true insights into the leadership skills and behaviors your organization needs. What Many of which we just talked about, right? What does not serve them but can be nice for teaming, for example, or interpersonal skill development and building trust, are those tools that slap a personality label on a person. So I don't want to call them out, but I guess I'll just say this, you know, if you're using or you're thinking that a psychometric tool that is putting a person in a color quadrant or a disc, sorry, I probably shouldn't have said that, or, a set of acronyms that kind of explain how they operate, great. Again, if you want to get to know someone, if you got a team that's kind of, storming and they've got to know how to interact with one another, fine. But if you're really trying to build up these skills, then my advice here in this space is to lean into psychometric assessment that is custom to the things that you're trying to solve for, so that you're actually getting to the root of your problems. Like, if a leader isn't driving results, why? What are the skills that they need in order to do that? And those are the things you should be assessing on. There's a lot of providers out there that do it. You can create your own if you need to with guidance or whatever. Um, but my point here, 360 tool, I guess, would be another example of that, is you can measure that over time. So you can set a baseline with an initial assessment. You can go through your leadership development programming and experiences, and then be able to reassess later so that you know how to continue to help folks. Okay. So what works? And I'm going to get into an example, a couple examples actually on the next slide. But before I go into that, small caveat. Um, this is what I believe works, what I'm seeing in the marketplace. And if you've got some different opinions, would love to hear from you, whether it's in the chat or at the end in our Q&A. But very first thing, and I've mentioned this already, linking leadership development directly to strategy, right? The outcomes of robust leadership development approaches should be an impact to the business. It should be baked into your goals. So I say goals, I say OKRs. However, your organization establishes goals, that is your entry point into your leadership development design, right? You've got to be able to have a starting point so that you get the measurable results that you want to see, both individually and organizationally. And that's an important thing for me to note. Again, this may not be news to some of you, but an individual needs to see progress in their own personal leadership journey and in their own performance results. But at an aggregate, your entire leadership team should be maturing upward, right? The other thing that I think is super important. I've put this into effect in companies that I've worked for. I'm seeing this, I'm starting to see this more in the marketplace, is your ability to bake into the design of your programs the use of applied learning and simulations that reflect real business challenges. You've got to prepare leaders to think across functions, not just their silos. So going back to what I was talking about at the beginning, owners versus operators, right? So often as people come up through the leadership pipeline, we're hiring them into or promoting them into those roles because they were an amazing individual contributor, and sometimes they've got it, sometimes they don't, right? But let's say they're really successful, they're still a little bit myopic in their thinking because they've come up through a specialized skill set that they had as an individual contributor, and now they're applying it to a leadership role. If we don't start early and start helping these people think more broadly across an organization about how their decisions, even in their area, impact the rest of the business, then we're doing them a disservice. So, start where you feel like. When I say early, I don't mean that, necessarily it has to happen in frontline leadership, but you should be thinking about it then. Those frontline leaders have a lot to take on. I know they often have massive spans of control, but folks need to be thinking about this from a leadership development perspective, how to get leaders thinking about that earlier as opposed to later. You don't want someone in middle or entry level executive levels not having that skill set. They will fail. So real world business challenges, thinking across the functions. I'm sorry, I meant the enterprise, but across their functions as well, and not just their silo. That's the new playbook. I refer to this as context over content, right? It can be done by bringing real life challenges and situations into your learning in a number of ways. You can do that via business simulation. You can do that with coaching cohort, where you're bringing groups of people that work together, or maybe work cross functionally together on a central or shared problem or challenge they're trying to solve. I know on the surface that that might not seem scalable, but it's really the only way you can ensure any level of efficacy. So, again, if you're not thinking this way and you're being kind of held back by the scalability of it, I would invite you to think a little bit differently about that, because if you're not, then what you're doing in essence is the legacy playbook. You're equipping people with skills and just sending them back to their jobs without any real world hands-on experience in how they're supposed to be going about their day. They often will just fall back into the old patterns. Okay, so I know there's a lot of words on this slide. I am not going to read all of them. They're here for you to kind of peruse through. I've made an attempt, as I'm building up a leadership practice in my current role, to think about what this really looks like in practice based on some of the critical competencies that we've talked about. Um, I think that most of what you see there in the proof point column are things that I've just talked about, right? So what I want to get into right now is a case study, just to kind of give you an example verbally. I can't get into specific firm names just because of privacy, but if you're exploring fresh approaches, I'd invite you to harness your digital and AI fluency and seek them out. Like a lot of case studies for people who are starting to do this or do this well can be found by doing a Google search or using your agentic AI tools. Obviously, if you are using agentic AI and it comes back with a solution, make sure that you source check that. But there are cases that you can find just by going out to the internet and exploring some of that a little bit. Okay, so this is the situation and the challenge. So there's a legacy engineering firm over 100 years old. It had grown via technical excellence and operations. I'm sure many of you can relate to this. But as disruption, sustainability pressures, and changing markets accelerated, it realized that technical and operational strengths alone wouldn't carry it forward. So this was the problem. Their leadership was fragmented. They had different divisions, countries, business units that had inconsistent leadership practices, decision styles, and accountability expectations. This particular firm decided that they needed unity in leadership, not just alignment and strategy. And to be fair, I know that that's very nuanced. They almost sound the same. But sometimes we wear some masks where the leaders might seem like they're aligned, but they're really not united. And so that's the difference there. And that's why I use that language. So what did they do? They co-designed with an external partner a multi-phase program that would embed new leadership behaviors across the organization globally. They began with deep discovery. So they didn't just do this in a vacuum, right? They didn't just do this because the CEO or the SLT stood up and said, "This is what we want to do." They went through a series of deep discovery. They did interviews, focus groups, cultural analysis so that they could find their blockers. Um, they went through the first wave of their pilot cohort with about 100 leaders, and the learning experience was a mix of immersive digital first modules that were customized by region, combined with local relevance. So I floated this concept earlier in a different context, but that's important. Oftentimes the core of what you're developing needs to remain the same, but you do need to pay attention sometimes to some local nuance or relevance, especially if you work for a global organization. The program wasn't just a training event, right? It was designed to change how their work gets done, how they drive results, how their leaders make decisions across functions, and not just to give them new skills. And a lot of that they got out of some of that cross pollination and real world experience baked into the design of their program. And so, what was the outcome? Obviously, we do a lot of the level one evaluation, and their leaders did rate the experience highly, which is sometimes tough. It's a tough nut to crack. Sometimes the leaders can be the most critical of the L&D function, and so that was nice, right? That they rated that experience highly. But more importantly, in follow-up surveys and assessments, because they continued to do that, the new leadership behaviors were among the top recognized shifts in the organization. And what that means is that people noticed real change, right? So it was the efficacy was becoming evident because transformation was happening. And because this change was embedded in operations and decisions practices, it created momentum toward a culture of shared accountability and adaptive leadership. So one of the things I wanted to call out about that is that in this particular case study was as much about the actual, design and the programming that they introduced, but maybe even more so was about the environment in which it had to exist, right? Because there's often things that need to happen outside of your leadership development approach that have to be true in order for that to be successful. And a lot of that has to do with your executive sponsorship, right? Your CEO and your senior level leaders really advocating for this change. A lot of this has to do with reinforcement and reward, right? So when you think about behavioral change, any of you who are change management practitioners will recognize this immediately. You have got to be able to not only put forth the compelling case as to why we have to change, but then you have to not only hold people accountable, but let's put a positive spin on it. You got to reward them for exhibiting those new behaviors. And so when you do that, that's kind of the sweet spot. The other thing I want to mention in the context of use cases, and I don't have I don't have a specific example of this for you right now beyond what I just highlighted. And this is not with the same company, but another thing that we're really seeing a lot of in the marketplace or starting to see is driving innovation, change, and transformation from the ground up, right? This requires skills and competencies of leaders that we're talking about today, along with more traditional ones, the power skills, right? Like collaboration, trust, delegation. Structured approaches to grassroots innovation require a leader to relinquish some of that control that they're used to having and let their employees think through the business case of what they want to see changed or what they want to innovate, um, highlight what the outcomes and the ROI of their ideas would be, and then usually, get that approved. The approach would be to get that approved through a committee and then have leadership sign off on it and implement it. But since they're the own ideas of the employees themselves, they will pursue them relentlessly and get really energized by it. And so in practice, when this is successful, it's what I'd call not just a win-win, but a win-win-win because it's good for the employees, they engage, it's great for the leaders. They're growing in this space because they're not necessarily the person who knows everything and they're not the person necessarily making this decision. The ideas are coming up from the employee. They're blessing it, right? But and it's also great for the business because if you can innovate and that drives real business outcomes, then it's good for the business as well. Okay. So the future starts today. This is just a bit of a summary of things that we've talked about today. I will just say that, again, I mentioned it earlier, context over content when you're developing your programs, do as much as you can, even though you may want to resist it because it's not as scalable, do as much as you can to bring real world experience into your learning design and execution. Digital and AI fluency are table stakes, goes without saying. Don't really need to say much more about that. But from a leadership development perspective, if your leaders aren't, if they're not comfortable in this space, it's incumbent upon us to help get them there. Granted, they're individuals and they own their own development and they should be getting themselves there as well. There's a lot that they can read, but I think organizationally, we need to help our leaders get there and understand how to harness the power of some of these digital tools. And then lastly, ownership mindset, right? Shifting the lens away from just my team to the business and drive innovation, accountability, and measurable results. Okay. If you do nothing else, here are 3 steps you can take tomorrow. Audit your leadership programs, right? We talked a little bit about ROI and measurement. I know a lot of you, out of all of the polls that we did, this is probably the sorest spot, but do what you can. Even if you don't have, investment and, massive tools to do it, there are things that you can do with simple surveys, with focus groups, leader interviews, that sort of thing. Number 2, embed AI fluency into how leaders learn. You can do this in everything, honestly, because AI is in everything now. And number 3, start developing leaders as owners, not just managers. And that has to do with this enterprise thinking and horizontal awareness, right? Small changes here create massive ripple effects. All right, so one more prompt. I just talked a lot. We haven't had a prompt for a while. This is not a poll. So again, use your chat function. Which of the 3 actions of these, right, feels most urgent for your organization? Auditing programs, embedding AI fluency, or shifting to an ownership mindset? Share it in chat. Shifting to an ownership mindset, auditing the program, shifting to the ownership mindset. Yep, auditing. Okay. Well, I know this group had AI cracked, so I'm not surprised not to see number 2 pop up too much in the chat. I think that makes sense, but let's not forget it, right? We have to bring the leaders along, not just for their own sake, but also like how they're going to manage their people as AI impacts our workplaces. But yeah, shifting to an ownership mindset, that's a tough one, and that's one that, gosh, if I think back, has been kind of following me around for the last 15 years or so. Again, because historically, our legacy organizations, especially if you work for an org that's not like a small startup or more entrepreneurial, If you work for a legacy org that has deep embedded silos, this is a tough one. The other thing I would talk about here, and I didn't mention it earlier, but just to kind of share with you all as we start to wrap this up and head to a few minutes of Q&A, is you got to think about how you're rewarding your leaders, right? If you continue to reward leaders for siloed behavior, they're going to continue to practice, exhibit, live that siloed behavior, right? So something to think about. I know changing a performance management architecture in a company is a big lift, but I think that goes without saying, and that's the selling point. If you want change as human beings, we just need to our reward systems need to be architected a little bit differently. All right. Okay, so here's your call to action. What's one action you'll take from today's conversation? Pop it in the chat. If you're serious about building the new leadership playbook in your organization, I think we should continue the conversation. You guys have my name, you know where to find me. So why don't you, the call to action, why don't we pop that into the chat before we go to Q&A? Finding ways to measure, defining how to audit, leadership development program, applied learning and business challenge, increased digital fluency. Awesome. All right. Well, obviously, as someone who talks about this quite a lot with peers and clients, I really obviously hope that you got something out of today. We can't solve the world's, problems in a 50-minute session, but we are now going to go to Q&A. And I believe for this one, you can is it a Q&A feature or just chat? I guess either.
Yeah, you can do either. There's Q&A or chat. We're monitoring both of those. So if you have any
Thank you. Mel,
questions
Mel,
now,
are you gonna,
yeah,
so I don't
sure.
have to look at them, you want to surface whatever comes up?
I sure can. Um, Here we go. So, what kinds of learning experiences beyond classroom training are most effective in building that strategic mindset?
Mm. All right. So for all of my learning and development leaders, I'm going to throw something out that you're very, very, very familiar with. It's 70-20-10, right? And a lot of folks say that that kind of varies based on what level you're at in the organization, but at the leadership level, it is absolutely 70-20-10. And if you don't know what 70-20-10 is, 70-20-10 is sort of a yardstick for those of us who use that system of measurement for how people learn. And 70% is experience, 20% is exposure, and 10% is education. So, pardon me, my voice is getting a little scratchy. So while we talked a lot today about the leadership development programming aspect of this, which is absolutely important to anchor this, what we're really looking at is 70% of experience is what drives a leader's behavioral development or skills development in this space. There's obviously a lot of books you can read on strategy. There's obviously a lot of programs that you can take and lean into, but the only way you do it, in my opinion, is by developing. Again, I don't want to overuse these words, but developing that ownership mindset, looking cross-functionally and horizontally, and doing that early on. I have worked for companies where they've actually built leadership competencies called horizontal thinking. You can do that and start defining what that looks like in your organization. But the basics of that, really, you guys, is really like, if let's just say I'm a mid-level manager in finance, right? I've got to understand in everything I know, and I've probably got some real specialized skills in finance because I'm managing people on my team that are adept at this skill set. But I've got to know how everything I'm doing in this space, even though I might be doing my work, meeting my goals, I've got to understand how that impacts HR. I've got to understand how that impacts operations. I got to understand how that impacts the technology organization or whatever that looks like for you, right? And if you're not bubbling up, if you're not bubbling up that, as a part of your leadership practice, and I don't mean your program necessarily, but just how you experientially develop leaders, then I think you'll fall short and you won't get there. I don't know. Hopefully that at least gave you something to think about.
I got one more question. Actually, I have two more questions for you.
Okay.
What types of situational leadership training would help for strategic ownership mindset? Real world business case or something general or a metaphor comparison that might be easier for leaders to consume and connect with? So, what types of
I
situational leadership training
Yeah.
would help for
Well,
strategic ownership mindset?
I've seen success with both of those examples that you just surfaced. Metaphorical. Okay, so this is what I'll say from my experience. Real world challenges get you better efficacy, but sometimes they can't be so heady that you can't get through them within your leadership development programming. I didn't go into a lot of detail on this, but when I think about the leadership development solution and those competencies that we just talked about, I think about embedding them into a leadership development experience that isn't just a 2 days or a week in one place. It really spans, maybe let's say a 6 month period or 9 month or whatever makes sense for you, where you're bringing leaders in over time and they're working on this problem that I'm talking about. But if it's too heady and if it's too much for the length of the program, or it's not something that we think could necessarily even be solved or attempted to be solved in the time that we have, or if people are just so mentally exhausted with what's going on in front of them that it doesn't make sense, then I do think you have the option to create something metaphorical. Like I said, I've seen it work both ways. I do think it's better to try to bring to the table the real world challenges that they're working on. And you can embed that into business simulations, which you can create yourself, or you can partner with an organization to create for you.
All right, great. We have right now just one more question, but we still have time. So if there's more questions, please post them. How can organizations strike the right balance between developing leadership soft skills like empathy and communication and the hard business acumen required to drive measurable outcomes?
Yeah, so I think this looks different for every company and where your real pain points are, right? So, kind of going back to measurement and understanding that a lot of you aren't doing much of this, but if you do go and audit your programs, I think the first thing you need to figure out is where's your baseline? If your folks aren't already operating at a high level, or at least a relatively high level of maturity with some of those softer skills, which I called human skills or power skills, then maybe you need to start there, right? Because, like I said earlier, these skills are still important. It's still important for leaders to understand how to interact with others and get work done through others, whether it's people that they lead or their peers or managing up through their leadership team. Everyone needs to learn those things. Now, you also don't want to get left behind, right? But we only have so much bandwidth to learn in any given amount of time. So if you're okay with those skills, I think you can continue to run maybe some of the programs that you are already running with the soft skills. And then I think you build this on top of it. And within the construct of driving, some of these competencies we talked about today, thread those human skills into it so that people aren't um, they're not fragmented, right? So that you're teaching people how they go together. Hopefully folks will you get that intuitively, but sometimes we need to bring them along, right? So if you're already running programs like that, I don't think there's anything wrong. In fact, I would highly encourage that you thread them through anything new that you're working on.
Well, that was the
Any
last
other
of the
questions, Jennifer?
questions that I've seen
Wonderful.
come in.
Well,
So
what's interesting is that I know we have 5 minutes left. My counter had me at an hour already, though, so I sort of sped up at the end. I apologize, but I mean there is a few minutes left if anyone else has anything to say. All right. Well, Mel, I'll let you take it away. I'll stop sharing.
well, you're welcome to
Oh,
keep sharing if you've got a contact slide or something like that, of course.
Oh gosh, I don't. I should have,
Okay.
but I don't. Yeah.
That's okay. Jennifer was kind enough to put your contact information also and ELB's information into the
Wonderful.
chat there. So, thanks to all of you. A big thank you to ELB Learning today for sponsoring this event and for Christine for sharing all that wonderful information. It's a very important topic in our industry always. And thanks to all of you for joining. We appreciate you participating today. This session was recorded and will be made available usually within a couple of business days. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in future events. Have a wonderful rest of the day or evening wherever you are in the world. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Christine.
you. Thank you. Bye bye.